that is your exit. There's only one road up there, and there's only one road out.
What were battle scenes that stuck out to you as you were researching this and surprised you?
Well, the first couple of nights, the battle scenes were just, the Marines trying to get accustomed to fighting at nighttime in the garish light of these flares, in snow-lit, moonlit mountains. It's kind of eerie. It's kind of an eerie way to fight, and to have these waves of Chinese soldiers coming at them, trying to figure out, how to fight them best. And there's a number of key places on the battlefield, the battlefield is really spread out over a pretty good stretch of terrain, about 40 miles along that road. But one of the key places is a place called Fox Hill, which was a hill that was guarding a hairpin turn in that road, and it was a place the Marines needed to hold at all costs. Fox Company was sent up there to hold that road, and they did. They sustained just horrible casualties. And I follow in the book a number of guys who were on Fox Hill and who had to hold off the Chinese night after night for 5 nights till they were finally relieved. And just the story of Fox Hill alone is just a fascinating study in courage and really, the thing about this battle is that there was so many individual acts of heroism. The extreme conditions of the battlefield, I think, brought that out in these guys to an unusual extent. It's one of our most decorated battles because when you're fighting like this, hand-to-hand combat, often using shovels and knives and bayonets in these kinds of conditions, it just brings out a different survival instinct that is pretty unusual in our battles.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that on the actual fighting, but your description of the conditions that the Marines faced, it made me think of something. Generals are often criticized for fighting the last war, that in the beginning of the battles in Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s, there was still lingering elements of a Cold War mentality of fighting a standard army that had to be adapted to, in some ways, guerrilla warfare. I could imagine the tactics that initially would be used on the ground would have been crafted according to fighting in the Pacific Theater in World War II, where you're on Pacific Islands. Maybe you have flamethrowers or other weapons to try to root out nests of soldiers bunkered into hills with the confidence that you have air superiority overhead. Was there any element of that in this being the first parts of the Korean War, where there's these lingering tactics held over from World War II that they had to adapt out of and do things, like you said, fight nighttime battles, fight in cold conditions, fight hand-to-hand, and everything else?
Yeah, all the officers in the 1st Marine Division, nearly all of them had fought in the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific and were experienced in that kind of warfare. And, amphibious landings on islands, marching into the jungles, rooting out an enemy that was, dug in. That's probably a vision of the Marine Corps that, that's what they'd always been used for, is amphibious, landings and taking an island by storm and holding it long enough for the army to arrive and take it over. That's the kind of the way the Marines like to view themselves, and they had trained to be an amphibious force. Now here they are going inland, hundreds of miles, up in really cold weather, and these officers who had fought at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and Peleliu are having to say, this isn't what Marines are supposed to do. This is not how we're supposed to be used, and this isn't how we trained. But they did adapt. They figured it out, and they're very proud of it. The Marine Corps has in their sort of pantheon of battles that they study and celebrate, just a handful that really stand out, and Chosin Reservoir is one of them. It's it's a battle that they embrace. They're proud of how they acquitted themselves in those mountains in a completely alien terrain to what most people think the Marines are trained for.
What are other aspects that are celebrated? I mean, you mentioned the terrible conditions, the terrible cold, fighting at night, many times in close quarters. What are other elements that really stand out in the Marine Corps lore?
Well, the rest of the battle after that first 4 or 5 days becomes the story of this breakout. A breakout is a complicated thing, and of course, one way to define the breakout is that it's a retreat. And of course, the Marines do not like to use the word retreat, and there's a lot of euphemisms for retreat in the military jargon. I get a kick out of some of the terms like retrograde maneuver, or an advance to the rear. General Smith said, "We're not retreating. We're simply attacking in another direction," which is a great little bit of verbal gymnastics, and something I try to use here in my household with my family. No, I'm just attacking in another direction. But that's what they were doing, because when you're completely surrounded on all sides by an enemy that's determined to annihilate you, that's numerically superior, movement in any direction is by definition a fight. It's an attack. Smith's goal was to get to lower ground, to get to a position that he could hold. And, he didn't know there was going to be an evacuation. He thought they were going to just get to a place down in the valley where he could hold indefinitely, maybe hold through the winter and regroup in the spring. So the Marines celebrate the idea that this was a fighting retreat, which is one of the most difficult maneuvers there is in warfare. It's hard to defend yourself when you're dug in, but when you're moving with tanks and vehicles and airplanes and artillery and wounded, and trying to get all those people out, and even get your dad out if you can, is a very tricky thing that involves tons of planning, tons of logistics, tons of engineering. And this is where Smith shines, because he had that kind of mindset. He was a planner. He was a very methodical guy. He was an intellectual. He was someone who worked closely with the engineers. And he saw this as an enormous puzzle that needed to be solved, or his division was going to be wiped out. And so they went to work. And this is the thing that's really celebrated by the Marine Corps is the notion of a well choreographed fighting withdrawal, and kind of embracing this notion that sometimes sometimes in a battle there's really only one thing you can do, and that's to get out of that situation as smartly and as safely as you can, and get to a place that you can defend and fight another day. And that's what. This is a textbook example of that.
And that shows his maturity as a general, because it's far more glorious, of course, to lead your troops into battle and march into France on VE Day. But to organize a disciplined retreat is, I would think, really shows your level of combat maturity, since if it's disorganized, that's where troops get killed in massive numbers. That's where militaries are completely dispirited, and public opinion can shift so that the war effort loses whatever energy it had. Marching into...
and I was going to say, on the west side of the peninsula, while the Chosin Reservoir battle is happening, there's a whole other story going on with the 8th Army and with some other UN forces that are over on that side. And at certain points, they just turned and ran. And, it was a disorganized, just hell for leather retreat. And a lot of people got killed because that's actually a dangerous way to get out of a situation. It's just to run like hell. they called it the Great Bug Out. And, you can kind of study what was happening on the west side of the peninsula and compare it to the marine exit from Chosin, and you sort of see two different stories and two different ways in which you extricate yourself from an ordeal.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, let's look at the end of this, at the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. How do the Marines successfully extricate themselves?
Well, hundreds of little choke points along the way that had to be defended. In one particular place, a bridge was blown by the Chinese over this great chasm, and the Marines had to figure out a way to rebuild a bridge by bringing in by parachute huge girders, and rebuilding a bridge within hours is essentially a massive exodus of thousands and thousands and thousands of Marines and their vehicles and their wounded, and in some cases they're dead, fighting their way, from point to point to point during this long serpentine 70-mile road. It becomes a series of battles along the way with certain key places that have to be defended at all costs. Meanwhile, they have to kind of fold up their operations and close down their enclaves in a systematic way until the final plane leaves the airfield from Hagaru. And to choreograph all that and to time it all is extremely tricky stuff. But they were able to do it, and they got 4,000 casualties out of there from this airfield. These were big planes that were coming in. It was, it almost has a quality of the Berlin airlift in the way that they were bringing in supplies and bringing out casualties and doing this while the Chinese were firing on these planes the whole time. But they do get out. They get their way to the sea, and I think the Marines were kind of hoping they were going to stay there and hold that position in Hungnam for the winter. But no, by this point, even MacArthur had figured out, no, we've got to get those guys out of there, get them to the south, get them, regroup, let them regroup and lick their wounds and reorganize for battles that would be coming early in 1951.
One follow-up, I was really intrigued by your description of having to build this bridge in the matter of hours. What did that look like? I mean, my imagination was, as these parts are being parachuted down, they're being assembled and trusses are being put up the exact second that their weight can be supported, and then the next one has to go out and out. Or what did that look like to have to build something that would normally take weeks or months of meticulous planning in a very short amount of time, but could mean death if you do it wrong?
Yeah, I mean, just seat of the pants kind of improvisational stuff. Like, I don't know, let's try this. They'd never built a bridge this way. And as they dropped those girders by parachute, some of them, drifted off in the wrong direction, and the Chinese got them, or they hit the ground too hard and were just irreparably damaged. And but they managed to get just enough of these trusses and other pieces together to kind of improvise a solution that worked well enough to support the weight of all these vehicles and tanks that were part of this long convoy. It's something like 13 or 14 miles of vehicles that had to get across this chasm. General Smith had this chief engineer, this guy, John Partridge, who was kind of the hero of the day. He came up with the solution. And, often the engineers are the unsung heroes of battles. They build bridges and they build airfields and they repair roads just in the nick of time sometimes. And that was certainly the case here. It almost had like a biblical feel to it of, like this mass exodus and, parting the Red Sea kind of thing. And suddenly they get to a point, this long convoy of humanity marching out of those mountains, they get to a point where there's a chasm and the road is, there's just no way around it. And the road has been blown, the bridge has been blown. Partridge had to solve that problem in a matter of hours, and it's really quite heroic and quite an amazing picture of